The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the mansion, but the kettle on the stove remained cold. The maid, a young black woman in a simple uniform with a weary look, had forgotten to heat the water. To anyone else, it would have been a trivial mistake, but not to the millionaire. He entered the kitchen with heavy steps, his face filled with arrogance and fury, as if that small mistake were an unforgivable crime. His voice cut through the air like a whip, insults, harsh words, humiliations, uttered in front of everyone. The maid lowered her eyes, holding back tears, but her silence did not hide her pain. The entire room stopped to watch the cruel scene, and the millionaire seemed to take pride in his own brutality. But no one imagined that the day would end not with her humiliated, but with him defeated. Amid the uncomfortable silence that gripped the mansion, a strange noise echoed. The sound of firm, resolute footsteps, shattering the arrogance that dominated the atmosphere. It was the gardener, blond, tall, with muscles marked by hard work, his blue eyes flashing with indignation. He approached slowly, his imposing presence drawing all eyes. The millionaire, still exalted, turned away with disdain, certain that no one would dare confront him, but he was wrong. The gardener stopped before him, staring him down firmly, and declared in a grave voice, "Enough! You've crossed the line." The hall held its breath. For the first time, someone was challenging the most powerful man in the house. The scene of humiliation was about to be reversed, and everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. The morning began like any other in the mansion. The scent of freshly cut flowers wafted from the gardens, mingling with the aroma of freshly ground coffee. The sound of the cutlery already set on the breakfast table sounded metallic, but something was out of place. The kettle remained cold on the stove. A simple detail, almost imperceptible to many but not to this man. The millionaire, accustomed to having every desire satisfied before even asking, entered the kitchen with footsteps that echoed like a storm warning. The maid, young, black, her short maid's uniform clinging to her figure, looked around the kitchen and felt a chill run down her spine. She had forgotten to heat the water. A trivial mistake, but one that would turn into a cruel spectacle. The millionaire raised his voice, filled with fury. These weren't just complaints. They were sharp words, humiliations calculated to crush her. He accused her of incompetence, of laziness, of being useless. Each syllable was a sentence, uttered before everyone in the room. The maid lowered her eyes, trying to hold back tears. Her silence, however, spoke louder than any justification. It wasn't the first time she'd suffered humiliation, but there was something about that morning that made the pain more unbearable. Perhaps it was the injustice of such a small mistake being turned into a crime. Perhaps it was the presence of the other employees, who watched in silence, forced to condone the cruelty. Or perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of carrying alone the weight of a life of contempt. The guests, accustomed to their host's arrogance, chuckled quietly or looked away. Some pretended not to hear, others murmured among themselves as if it were just another common spectacle in the house. To them, the maid's humiliation was cheap entertainment, as trivial as the notes of music played on the piano in the main hall. But there was one who wouldn't look away. From the garden, through the open door, the imposing figure of the gardener approached. Tall, blond, his muscles rippled from hard work, his blue eyes sparkling in the morning light. He heard every word, felt every venom dripping from the millionaire's mouth, and the blood in his veins began to boil. The maid, her arms trembling, tried to hide her embarrassment. The millionaire took a step forward, his finger pointing at her, as if ready to make her an example of his authority. But at that moment, a new sound echoed through the room. Firm, heavy, resolute footsteps. The gardener walked through the door, his presence filling the room with a new energy. Everyone fell silent. Eyes turned to him. The millionaire looked up, surprised, but confident that no one would dare interfere. The maid, in turn, felt a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time, there was someone there who might not allow the humiliation to continue. And in that heavy silence, everyone understood that the scene was about to change course. The room was completely silent. The millionaire, still pointing his finger at the maid, turned slowly when he realized the firm footsteps echoing behind him didn't belong to a guest nor a submissive servant. The air seemed heavy as the gardener entered, his muscles tense, his gaze icy and steady, filled with indignation. The difference between the two men was evident. One was built on figures and arrogance, the other on brute strength and dignity. The millionaire smiled contemptuously, as if he saw only an insolent intruder. "And you?" he said, his voice thick with irony. "Have you come to defend someone who doesn't even know how to do his job?" The gardener didn't look away. His blue eyes were like blades, and his deep voice echoed through the hall. "I came because I'm tired of watching this cowardice." Each word echoed like a blow, and the guests took a step back, uncomfortable. The maid, stunned, put her hand to her chest. No one had ever dared to speak to her boss like that. Her eyes, still teary, met the gardener's, and in that instant she realized she was no longer alone. The millionaire laughed, but it was forced. "Cowardice. She's paid to serve, and if she makes a mistake, she should learn." The gardener stepped forward, closing the distance. "Teaching isn't humiliating. What you did isn't discipline, it's cruelty." His voice was firm, and each syllable seemed to rip through the silence like thunder. The guests looked at each other, torn between fear and excitement. Many had never seen anyone challenge the millionaire in his own home. Others murmured that this would be the end of the gardener, that no one dared cross the line of authority without paying dearly. But there was something in his gaze that silenced even the most skeptical. The millionaire, enraged, took a step forward, standing just inches from the gardener. The two stared each other down, the tension almost palpable. The contrast was stark. On one side, the man in the expensive suit, supported by the power of money. On the other, the man with strong arms, hardened by work, sustained by the strength of courage. "You're fired." The millionaire's voice boomed like thunder, trying to crush his rival for authority. But the gardener didn't back down. On the contrary, he leaned forward slightly, his deep voice sounding like a suppressed thunder. "I no longer work for you. I never worked for you. I work for my conscience, and it will no longer be silenced." A murmur rippled through the room. It was as if each word were a slap in the face to the millionaire's arrogance. The maid, wide-eyed, felt her chest heave for the first time that morning. The millionaire, unsure how to react, tried to laugh again, but his mask was crumbling. The gardener remained firm, his gaze fixed, like a wall that couldn't be toppled by the weight of money. And everyone knew the confrontation was just beginning. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. The millionaire, still facing the gardener, sought to regain the aura of authority that had always accompanied him. His eyes sparkled, but behind the fury was a glimmer of insecurity. He had never been confronted in his own home, in front of his wife, his guests, and, worse, by someone he considered nothing more than an inferior employee. "You dare raise your voice against me?" he asked, each word spat like venom. The gardener didn't back down. His body was erect, his muscles marked by the routine work under the sun, his blue eyes fixed, conveying the dangerous calm of someone who fears nothing. "I dare because I've seen too much," he replied. "Everyone here saw it, everyone heard it, and no one will pretend it didn't happen anymore." A murmur ran through the room. Some guests clapped their hands over their mouths. Others looked away, embarrassed by their own complicity. The millionaire felt the weight of these gazes like invisible daggers. His empire, built on fear and arrogance, was now being eroded by the unexpected courage of a simple man. The maid, still motionless, felt her heart pounding. The scene seemed like an impossible dream. Someone taking her pain, speaking out for her, breaking the cycle of humiliation that had always imprisoned her. Her eyes filled with tears, but not of sadness. They were tears of relief. The millionaire, sensing the crowd was against him, tried to turn the tide. He straightened his body, opened his arms theatrically, and said loudly, "Do you think this man is right?" Do you think a mistake, a simple oversight, should be ignored? In this house, discipline is what sustains everything you see. But his rhetoric, which had so often intimidated, now rang hollow. The guests glanced at one another uncertainly, some frowning, others refraining from applauding. The gardener took another step forward and replied, "Discipline isn't humiliation, and respect can't be bought with money." His voice echoed loudly, reverberating off the walls, as if the house itself were supporting him. The millionaire, overcome with fury, leaned in close until his face was almost touching the gardener's. "I could finish you off right now. One word from me and you'll never work anywhere again." The gardener didn't blink. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Maybe. But today everyone saw who you really are. And that, not even all your money can erase." The silence that followed was deafening. The millionaire felt his legs tremble, but he didn't back down. His pride kept him standing, even though his authority was already shattered. The gardener, on the other hand, no longer needed to prove anything. His presence, his courage, and his words had already tipped the scales, and in that moment, everyone knew. The humiliation had changed hands. The hall, once a stage for laughter and ostentation, now felt like a silent cathedral. The contrast was painful. Where once the arrogance of an untouchable man towered, now there was only a panting millionaire, struggling to maintain his mask of authority before the collective gaze. The guests, accustomed to fawning and applauding his every gesture, were disconcerted. It was as if they had realized for the first time that the crystal idol had always been just that, crystal, fragile and brittle. The women in luxurious dresses whispered to each other, some with expressions of disapproval, others secretly relishing the downfall of the man who had so often made them feel small. The men, in their expensive suits, tried to hide their discomfort, but their averted gazes betrayed their shame at having been silent. Accomplices to so much cruelty. The maid, still motionless, watched everything as if waking from a nightmare. Her body still trembled, but the flame in her eyes began to shine with new intensity. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. The gardener was at her side, and the crowd's gazes, previously filled with contempt, now reflected something different: respect. It wasn't complete, not sincere in everyone, but it was enough to break the feeling of invisibility that had crushed her for years. The millionaire, sensing the change in mood, tried to regain control. He straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and spoke aloud. "You are judging without understanding. This house only exists because I demand discipline. Without order, everything falls apart." But the words, which had so often echoed like laws, now sounded hollow. No one responded. No one applauded. Only the heavy silence of an audience that no longer believed his speech. The gardener then raised his chin and, in a firm voice, declared, "What brings a house down isn't a lack of discipline, it's a lack of respect." The phrase fell like a sentence. The guests sighed. Some nodded discreetly. The millionaire felt the impact, as if he had been physically struck. His eyes flashed with anger, but there was no response. The maid, tears held back, finally lifted her face. She crossed her arms over her chest, not in defiance, but as if protecting herself while demonstrating firmness. Her posture changed. She was no longer the cowering figure in the kitchen, humiliated by the forgotten coffee water. Now she was an upright, visible woman whose silence spoke louder than any words. The guests murmured louder and louder. The scandal could no longer be hushed up. The millionaire, once the absolute lord, was now seen as the man who had lost control in front of everyone. The party, which was supposed to celebrate power and wealth, became a showcase for his falling image. And deep down, everyone knew. This wasn't just the maid's victory or the gardener's courage. It was the first public crack in the empire of fear the millionaire had built for years. The millionaire still tried to maintain his image, but the mask was already cracked. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his hands trembled, and his once imposing voice now sounded like a hollow echo. The guests, accustomed to revering him, no longer saw authority in his gestures, only desperation. The heavy silence in the hall was crueler than any words. Suddenly, a muffled chuckle rose from one of the tables. One of the guests, unable to contain his nervousness, let out a short laugh. but it was enough to set the atmosphere ablaze. Others, embarrassed, looked away. The millionaire heard the sound as if it were a slap. He turned around, shouting, demanding respect. But no one obeyed. His voice no longer controlled anything. The maid, arms crossed, stood firm. Her serious gaze and erect posture showed that she no longer carried only the pain of humiliation. She also carried the strength of someone who would no longer be invisible. Every second she remained standing was like a silent challenge against everything he represented. And then the millionaire's wife stood up, blonde, elegant, her red dress shimmering in the chandeliers. She strode firmly to the center of the room. Her blue eyes were cold, hard as ice. Her expression held a mixture of contempt and suppressed vengeance. "You always prided yourself on bossing everyone around," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "But today even your own house no longer respects you." The guests' murmurs exploded. The scene, already charged with tension, now transformed into an irreversible spectacle. The millionaire, already shaken by the confrontation with the gardener, felt the blow of his wife's words like a blade piercing his authority. He tried to respond, but his voice faltered. The gardener stood firm, watching in silence. His presence was like a wall behind the maid, a reminder that there was someone willing to protect her until the end. The young woman, teary-eyed, watched everything with a mixture of shock and relief. For the first time, her master's arrogance was being crushed not only by the courage of a simple man, but also by his own wife, who now exposed his weakness before everyone. The millionaire staggered back a step, breathing heavily. He tried to resume his speech, tried to regain his confidence, but there was no longer an audience to hear him. Every guest saw him for what he truly was, a man defeated by his own arrogance, and deep down everyone knew that that moment would be remembered not as the night of a party, but as the night when an empire of fear crumbled before the courage of a maid, the firmness of a gardener and the cold judgment of a wife. The millionaire was breathing heavily, his eyes brimming with tears from the anger and humiliation that gnawed at his chest. The entire room watched him in silence, and each glance seemed like a mirror reflecting not the powerful man he always wanted to portray, but the fragile, shattered figure he revealed before everyone. The pride that had always been his armor was now nothing more than a weight, dragging him down even deeper. Suddenly he exploded. His voice broke the silence like thunder. "Enough! No one here has the right to judge me." The explosion of words echoed through the hall, causing some guests to recoil in fright. The gardener, however, did not move. He remained firm, his eyes fixed, like a wall unshaken by the roar of a wounded lion. The maid did not move either. Arms crossed, her gaze serious and cold, it was as if each word her master spat no longer had the power to reach her. The millionaire, overcome with despair, began to pace in circles. He ran his hand through his hair, muttered incoherent phrases, and sometimes glared at the gardener with hatred, as if he wanted to attack him. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the stark difference between his uncontrolled fury and the blue-eyed blonde's unshakable calm. Perhaps it was the fear of further exposing his own weakness. "You think you know everything," he said, his voice hoarse, his finger pointing at the guests. "But none of you would be here without me. Everything you have, everything you enjoy, is because I built it." The hall didn't respond. No one applauded. No one agreed. The collective silence was more devastating than any booing. It was the public abandonment of the man who had once believed himself untouchable. His wife, still erect, watched coldly, her lips curved in a barely perceptible smile. She knew, with each word he spoke, the fall deepened. The gardener, his arms crossed over his chest, simply said gravely, "A man truly reveals himself not when he has everything, but when he loses control." The sentence fell like a stone into the lake, reverberating throughout the mansion. The millionaire, in an impulsive gesture, advanced on the gardener. The guests jumped to their feet in alarm, some screamed, but the blonde stood firm. He didn't back down. When the millionaire approached, the gardener simply raised his hand and calmly restrained him, as if restraining a raging child. Silence returned, heavy. The millionaire panted, sweating, defeated not by physical strength, but by the absence of authority. His outburst, instead of restoring power, only confirmed his downfall. The maid, looking at him, understood in that instant that the humiliation had changed hands. It was no longer hers. Now every glance, every whisper, every judgment was directed at the man who had so often made her feel invisible. And for the first time, she took a deep breath without feeling afraid. The scene seemed suspended in time. The millionaire, still panting and sweating, had lost not only control of the situation, but also the aura of power that had always accompanied him. The gardener, steadfast, stood like a pillar of resistance, never giving up a step. But it was the maid who stole the spotlight. She slowly uncrossed her arms, lifted her chin and took a step forward. The silence in the room deepened. Her once tearful eyes now burned with a flame no one expected. It was as if, after years of humiliation, she had finally found her voice, and that voice didn't require shouting, just the firmness of her posture. The guests held their breath. The millionaire tried to make a gesture of authority, but failed. His accusing finger trembled, his choked voice no longer convincing anyone. "You're nothing but an ungrateful servant," he said, but his tone sounded fragile, lacking the weight of before. The maid held his gaze. Her voice was calm but sharp. "Servant, yes. Ungrateful, no. What I will never be again is invisible." The sentence fell like a final sentence. The room erupted in murmurs, and some guests even applauded discreetly, as if recognizing the courage of those words. The millionaire paled, staggering back a step. The wife, motionless, in her red dress, watched the scene with watchful eyes. There was no compassion in her expression, only the bitter satisfaction of seeing her husband finally exposed. The gardener, beside the young woman, raised his chest protectively, but made it clear that he would not be the one to speak for her. This was her moment. The millionaire, desperate, tried to recover. "Are you against me? All of you? Because of her?" His voice sounded more like a plea than an accusation, but the eyes were no longer on him. They were on the young maid who for the first time was seen not as a disposable piece of furniture, but as a symbol of dignity. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, said firmly, "The respect you demand is not respect, it's fear, and the fear is over." A shiver ran through the room. The words echoed, drenching the space with a truth no one could deny. The millionaire, weakened, brought his hands to his face and let out a sob. His once imposing figure was now but the shadow of a defeated man. The maid stood firm, her face serious, her arms crossed again. It was as if she had taken upon herself not only her own dignity, but also the strength of those who, in silence, had always suffered in silence. And in that instant, everyone understood. The humiliation had changed hands forever. The silence weighed like lead, but the millionaire was unwilling to accept defeat. The pride that had always sustained him now turned to despair. His eyes, red and inflamed, darted around the room in search of allies. But all he found were cold faces, suspicious glances, and murmurs that grew like fire in dry straw. Then he played his last card. With a sudden movement, he walked over to a sideboard and opened a hidden drawer. He withdrew a dark leather folder filled with documents. His fingers trembled as he lifted the pages into the air. "Do you want to see me fall?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Well, know that you all owe me something, all of you." The pages shook in his hands, as if they were evidence of shared crimes, secrets he'd kept to maintain his dominance. The hall erupted in murmurs. The guests looked at each other in panic, some paling, others swallowing hard. His strategy was clear. If he were to fall, he would drag everyone down with him. His wife lifted her chin, her gaze even colder. "You've always lived like this, haven't you?" she said sharply. "Money isn't enough. You need chains to keep everyone around you." The gardener took a step forward, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the millionaire. "You've just shown what you truly are," he declared, his deep voice echoing like thunder. "A man who only knows how to sustain himself through fear." The maid, still standing firm, crossed her arms again. Her serious eyes met her master's, and for the first time she spoke loudly for all to hear. "Fear doesn't work anymore. The impact was immediate. The guests, who had previously been murmuring, now fell silent, as if that sentence were a gavel striking the final verdict. The millionaire trembled, sweat streaming down his face, and tried to hold the documents up, but his hands were no longer steady. The gardener then reached out and, without violence, snatched the briefcase from him. He threw it onto the nearest table, the papers scattered across the floor, but no one bent down to pick them up. No one was afraid anymore. The millionaire's authority was gone. The man, now empty, staggered and fell to his knees. The tears tore from his throat in muffled sobs. The entire hall watched, witnessing the final downfall of someone who had believed himself unreachable. The wife turned away, as if she had nothing left to say. The gardener remained firm but silent, and the maid, standing erect, her face serious and dignified, became the absolute center of the scene. I didn't need to smile or celebrate. Her simple posture was enough to mark the victory. And everyone understood. That was the end of an empire of arrogance. The millionaire remained on his knees, his face streaked with sweat and despair, as if all the strength that had once sustained him had been drained before everyone's eyes. The papers scattered on the floor were silent witnesses to his failed attempt to cling to power. There were no longer any documents, threats, or money that could save his image. His downfall was complete. The maid took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her erect figure, arms crossed and short, simple uniform, contrasted with the imposing, expensive dresses surrounding her. But it was she, not they, who carried dignity. Her steady eyes met those of her defeated employer, and in that instant, everyone understood. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation. His wife, standing in her red dress, watched the scene coldly. There was no joy on her face, only the bitter confirmation that the empire she had built alongside him had always been sustained by lies. The gardener, imposing, stood behind the maid, not as a hero stealing her moment, but as the silent guardian of her victory. The millionaire tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. The sobs stuck in his throat were the last sounds of a man who had lost everything without a single word being said. The maid lifted her chin and, without raising her voice, said, "What you destroyed wasn't me. It was yourself." The words echoed through the hall, cutting the air like blades. The guests lowered their eyes in shame. There was no longer an audience willing to laugh. Everyone had been forced to see their own complicity in the years of silence and fear. She then walked to the main table, calmly picked up a linen tablecloth and placed it over the scattered papers. She didn't need to see or show it. What had happened was enough to scar everyone there. Then she turned toward the door. Her footsteps echoed loudly on the marble floor, each click of her heels like a bell heralding the end of an era. The gardener followed her with his eyes but didn't move. He knew that this exit needed no escort. It was hers, and hers alone. His wife remained motionless, but her tearful eyes revealed that, even in her coldness, she had understood. This young woman, invisible until that morning, had done what no one else dared. When the door closed behind her, the hall fell silent. A silence of mourning, not for the maid, but for the shattered power of the man who had knelt. The guests knew. They would never forget that night. The turning point wasn't the scream, the violence, or revenge. It was silence transformed into a weapon. It was dignity raised against arrogance. And above all, it was proof that all the money in the world can't buy the respect lost when the truth finally finds the courage to reveal itself. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to follow more stories like this.